Ma'am, step away from the vehicle, please.
Am I being detained, officer?
We got a report. Look, just step back so we can sort this out.
What report?
And what probable cause do you have to enter my garage?
Ma'am, I'm an attorney. I work for the
You're
Department of
currently
Justice.
violating my...
On a warm evening in July 2019, the streets of a quiet Washington, D.C. suburb lay peaceful under the amber glow of streetlights. In one particular driveway, a black SUV pulled slowly into an attached garage. Behind the wheel sat a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades building a career in justice. She was a senior attorney at the United States Department of Justice. Not just any attorney, but one who specialized in civil rights enforcement. Her case record included landmark victories against institutional discrimination. She knew the Constitution not as an abstract document, but as living, breathing protection that she defended every single day. As she pressed the garage door button and watched it descend behind her vehicle, she had no reason to expect what was about to unfold. In her own garage, in her own home. What she didn't know was that in the next few minutes, her professional expertise and her lived reality were about to collide in the most disturbing way possible. And that collision would expose a truth that no amount of degrees, titles, or credentials could shield her from. The garage door hadn't even fully closed when she heard it. The aggressive rev of an engine. Bright headlights suddenly flooded through the narrowing gap. The police cruiser had pulled partially into her driveway, angled to block any exit. She remained in her vehicle, hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly as she'd advised countless clients to do. The garage door stopped halfway, leaving her suspended between the private sanctuary of her home and the public space where police authority theoretically reigned. 2 officers emerged. The lead officer, a white male in his mid-30s with 7 years on the force, approached with his hand resting on his service weapon. "Ma'am, turn off the vehicle and step out," he commanded. She lowered her window. "Officer, I live here. This is my home. Can you tell me what this is about? I'm not going to ask again." "Exit the vehicle now." Rachel Chambers made a calculated decision. She would comply, but she would also document. Her phone was already recording audio, a habit developed from reviewing too many cases where the only evidence was an officer's word against a citizen's truth. "I'm stepping out now," she said clearly. "My hands are visible." She emerged wearing business casual attire. Blazer, slacks, low heels. Her Department of Justice identification badge hung on a lanyard around her neck. The DOJ seal clearly visible, but the officers didn't seem to notice it. "Whose vehicle is this?" the lead officer demanded. "It's mine. I own this vehicle and this home." "Can I see identification?" "Of course. It's in my purse." "May I reach for it?" "Why were you pulling into the garage so quickly?" The question hung in the air, absurd in its implication. She was pulling into her own garage at normal speed, at the end of a workday. But the subtext was clear. "You look suspicious. You don't belong here." "I live here," she repeated. "I'm returning home from work." The younger officer swept his flashlight across her garage interior. Storage boxes, gardening tools, a bicycle. Looking for what? Evidence of existing in her own space? "We received a call about suspicious activity in this neighborhood," the lead officer stated. A vehicle matching this description was reported. She felt the familiar sensation, that uniquely American experience of being black, and therefore automatically suspicious. She'd prosecuted cases exactly like this, and now here she stood, living the very injustice she fought against. "What specifically was reported as suspicious?" she asked, her legal training taking over. "Ma'am, I need you to provide identification and proof that you live here." "I will. But I need you to understand that you followed me into my private property without probable cause, without witnessing any crime, and without my consent. My garage is part of my residence, and you're currently inside it without a warrant?" The words came out firm but professional, precise, the same tone she used in federal courtrooms when dismantling weak arguments. The lead officer's posture stiffened. "Are you refusing to comply?" "I'm not refusing anything. I'm stating facts while I comply." She moved deliberately to her vehicle, narrating every motion. Her fingers found her federal credentials, the ones that identified her as a senior attorney for the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She held the credentials out, flipping them open with practiced precision. The gold badge caught the light. The words, "Department of Justice," were embossed in bold letters. The officer's flashlight beam fell directly on the credentials. His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. His hand dropped from his weapon. The younger officer whispered, "Oh shit." Officer Morrison's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the credentials, then at her face, then back, as if hoping they might transform into something less damning. What happened next would spark an investigation reaching the highest levels of both local law enforcement and federal oversight. "I'm Senior Attorney Rachel Chambers," she said, her voice now carrying different weight. "I specialize in pattern and practice investigations of law enforcement agencies. Would you like to explain what probable cause you had to follow me onto my private property?" The silence was suffocating. Officer Morrison seemed to calculate 100 responses and find all of them inadequate. "Ma'am," Attorney Chambers. There was a call," he stammered. "What was the substance of that call? What crime was I suspected of committing?" His partner had backed up several steps. "We should call a supervisor," Officer Hayes said urgently. "That's an excellent idea," Rachel agreed. "You should also know that I've been recording audio from the moment you pulled behind me." Morrison's face flushed red. His career, his pension, his entire professional future seemed to flash before his eyes. "Attorney Chambers, I apologize," he began. But she raised her hand. "Don't apologize to me right now. Call your supervisor. We're going to do this properly." Sergeant David Williams arrived 7 minutes later. He was a 22-year veteran, a black man who had navigated institutional racism while rising through ranks. His expression suggested he already knew this would be complicated. After speaking with Morrison, Williams approached with hands visible, non-threatening. "Attorney Chambers, I'm Sergeant Williams. I need to understand what happened." "What happened, Sergeant, is that I was followed onto my private property by 2 of your officers without probable cause and was interrogated about my presence in my own home, all while my DOJ credentials were visibly displayed around my neck." Williams looked at Morrison. The credentials were visible. Rachel lifted the lanyard. The DOJ seal was unmistakable. Morrison's silence confirmed it. "This will be investigated thoroughly," Williams said, understanding the gravity. "I'm contacting the chief directly tonight." "It will be investigated," Rachel confirmed. "By your department, yes, but also by people I work with. What happened here potentially constitutes a Fourth Amendment violation, harassment, and racial profiling. Your officers entered the curtilage of my home without consent or exigent circumstances, but this was only the beginning. The investigation that followed would uncover details that would transform this from a localized incident into a federal case study." Within 72 hours, Rachel had documented everything. She'd filed formal complaints with Internal Affairs, the Civilian Oversight Board, and her supervisors at the Department of Justice. Lieutenant Sharon Martinez, heading the Internal Affairs investigation, reviewed the body cam footage with growing concern. The video showed everything Rachel described: Morrison accelerating to catch her vehicle, the aggressive approach, the command tone without explanation, and most damaging, Rachel's DOJ credentials were clearly visible from the moment she stepped out. Morrison had seen the badge. The lighting was adequate. The angle was clear. He'd seen it, and either didn't process what it meant or didn't care. But the truly explosive element was the original 911 call. Martinez listened to it repeatedly, her jaw tightening each time. The anonymous caller had reported a suspicious, black female in an expensive vehicle driving slowly through the neighborhood, possibly casing homes for burglary. The description focused entirely on race. "Doesn't look like she belongs in this area," the caller had said explicitly. The entire encounter was predicated on racial profiling. The emergency meeting included the chief of police, city attorney, mayor's staff, and external civil rights attorneys. They were preparing for a legal battle they couldn't win. "Let me understand," the city attorney said. "We have a federal civil rights attorney who was racially profiled by a 911 caller, then illegally detained in her own garage by officers who ignored her visible federal credentials." Chief Robert Harrison nodded grimly. "And it gets worse." He slid across Officer Morrison's personnel file, 3 previous complaints of excessive force during stops involving black citizens. All resulted in counseling and retraining rather than discipline. "This establishes a pattern. an external attorney, observed. Her lawyers will demonstrate that the department knew Morrison had racial bias issues and failed to correct them. That's deliberate indifference under Monell. In simpler terms, if a city knows an officer is problematic and does nothing, the city pays the consequences. What does Attorney Chambers want? Someone asked. That's what concerns me, the chief said. She hasn't made demands, no settlement offer, just filed a complaint and then silence. She's building a case. What they didn't know is that Rachel wasn't building a case for personal settlement. She was building a case for systemic change. She'd contacted the ACLU, who expressed interest in filing amicus briefs. She'd reached out to the NAACP, who mobilized community members. And she'd filed a formal request for the Department of Justice to open a pattern or practice investigation of the entire police department. When body cam footage went public through a reporter's records request, community response was immediate and forceful. The town hall became a referendum on the department's treatment of minority residents. Rachel sat in the audience, taking notes as other black residents shared their stories. One man described being pulled over 7 times in 2 years for minor infractions. A woman recounted being followed through a parking lot because her expensive purse seemed incongruous with the officers' assumptions. The patterns were undeniable. What happened to Rachel wasn't isolated. It was the most visible example of a systemic problem. Chief Harrison looked increasingly uncomfortable as testimonies continued. He'd implemented bias training, hired a diversity officer, updated policies. But none of it had prevented Morrison from following a black woman into her garage based on nothing more than an anonymous, racist call. The consequences would be severe for Morrison, for the department, but more importantly, they would force a long-delayed reckoning. Officer Joseph Morrison faced a 3-member disciplinary panel. His union representative sat beside him, but both knew the defenses were exhausted. The evidence was overwhelming. Deputy Chief Angela Roberts read the findings. Officer Morrison, this panel finds that on July 18, 2019, you violated departmental policy, failure to establish reasonable suspicion, unlawful entry onto private property, and conduct unbecoming by failing to identify clearly displayed federal credentials. Furthermore, your personnel record demonstrates a pattern of disproportionate stops against minority citizens, suggesting that bias influenced your actions. Morrison's representative attempted intervention, but Roberts continued, training does not erase constitutional violations. Officer Morrison's actions weren't just against policy, they were against the law he swore to uphold. Officer Joseph Morrison, you are hereby terminated effective immediately. Your certification will be revoked, and this panel recommends permanent ineligibility for law enforcement employment. Rachel, represented by a civil rights law firm working pro bono, sat at the plaintiff's table as the city approached with a settlement proposal. Her federal lawsuit alleged Fourth Amendment violations and municipal liability for systemic failures. The complaint detailed Morrison's 3 prior complaints and inadequate departmental responses. It presented data showing black residents were stopped at rates 7 times higher than white residents, despite comprising only 18% of the population. It included expert testimony on racial profiling. The city's attorney looked exhausted. Attorney Chambers, our clients offer $850,000 to settle all claims, plus reforms including third-party monitoring of stops for 3 years, mandatory body cameras, and overhauled complaint procedures. Rachel conferred with her team before responding. We'll accept the financial settlement, but the reforms aren't sufficient. We want a consent decree monitored by a federal judge, quarterly public reports on stop data broken down by race, a civilian review board with actual disciplinary authority, not just recommendations. And we want the 911 caller identified and prosecuted. The city agreed to everything except prosecuting the caller. The individual had used a burner phone and was never identified, but everything else was incorporated into a consent decree that would fundamentally reshape the department. On November 12, 2019, the settlement was approved. The city would pay Rachel Chambers $850,000. Morrison's termination was upheld. Officer Hayes received a 30-day suspension and mandatory retraining. But the true victory was the institutional transformation the settlement mandated. The consent decree forced comprehensive data tracking on every stop, search, and use of force. Within 6 months, the patterns became undeniable. The data confirmed what Black residents had reported for years: disproportionate targeting, searching, and force. The Civilian Review Board, chaired by Margaret Chen, Rachel's neighbor who witnessed the incident, began reviewing complaints with real authority. 3 more officers with patterns of biased policing were identified and terminated. Chief Harrison embraced the reforms. "What happened to Attorney Chambers was unconscionable," he said publicly, "but her willingness to fight has made us a better department and forced us to confront truths we should have addressed years ago." Rachel Chambers continues her work as a senior DOJ attorney. She uses the incident when training others, turning her violation into a teaching moment. She donated $200,000 of the settlement to organizations providing legal assistance to low-income victims of police misconduct. The garage where she was detained is still her garage. She parks there every evening, but now she does so knowing the incident that violated her rights also catalyzed changes protecting others. "I had advantages most victims don't have," she reflected. "I had credentials, legal knowledge, resources to fight. But what about people without those advantages? Who speaks for them? Who ensures they get justice?" So what can we learn from Rachel's experience? First, understand Fourth Amendment protections. Police need reasonable suspicion based on specific facts, not hunches, stereotypes, or anonymous tips lacking detail. Second, your home's curtilage, garages, and driveways receive strong, constitutional protection. Police cannot enter without consent, a warrant, or exigent circumstances. Third, document everything safely. Record, if possible. Remember details. Get witness names. File formal complaints with oversight bodies and organizations like the ACLU. Fourth, understand that settlement amounts serve multiple purposes. They compensate victims, punish systemic failures, and incentivize reforms. Rachel's $850,000 wasn't just for her. It was a message that constitutional violations carry real consequences. Finally, change happens when people with resources and knowledge use them for those without. Rachel could have taken a quick settlement and moved on. Instead, she fought for transparency and reform, benefiting everyone. If you experience police misconduct, resources exist. The ACLU offers legal assistance. The National Police Accountability Project connects victims with attorneys. Local civilian oversight boards can investigate even if internal affairs refuses. Your rights exist not just on paper, but in practice. If you know them, assert them, and hold the system accountable when they're violated. This is what happens when those who enforce the law forget it applies to them too, when bias corrupts judgment, and when victims refuse to accept violation as the price of existing while Black in America. Rachel Chambers stood in her garage and changed a system. The question is, what will you do when the moment calls?